All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. If you find your seats. Sure. There we go. Okay, we're ready to get started. If everyone can find their seats. So welcome to the Policy Review Committee. The TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nation communities across our vast regional district, and today we are located on Tecumlip-Secwepemc territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership we have with Tecumlip-Secwepemc and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. So since this is the first meeting of this Policy Review Committee, we will now move to the election of chair and vice chair.
Thank you. So nominations will be called 3 times. As candidates are nominated, they will be asked if they consent to the nomination, and then nominations will be closed. If there is only one consenting candidate, that candidate will be acclaimed as the chair or vice chair when we carry out that election. If there are 2 or more consenting candidates, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to say a few words if they wish before the ballots are distributed. I will now call for nominations for the position of chair for the Policy and Governance Committee. Would anyone like to nominate someone?
I'll nominate Director Bass.
Director Bass, do you accept the nomination? Second. Second call for nominations for the office of chair. Third and final call for nominations for the office of chair. I declare the nominations closed for the office of chair. Director Bass is acclaimed to the office of chair for the Policy and Governance Committee. I will now call for nominations for the office of vice chair. Director Morris, do you accept the nomination? Thank you. Second call for nominations for the office of vice chair. Third and final call for nominations. I declare the nominations closed. Director Morris has been acclaimed to the office of vice chair for the Policy and Governance Committee. I will now turn the meeting over to Chair Bass. I am Chair Bass. Yes, thank you. So this is the first meeting of the Policy and Governance Committee. So I wanted to provide a bit of background on the mandate and role of the committee and the types of items that will be coming to this committee. So background, the policy formally was called the Policy Review Committee, was established in 2003. And this committee ceased meeting in 2018 after a really extensive review of TNRD policies. And then a request from the board in 2021 came forward that the committee be reconvened. The purpose of the committee at the time was to discuss and provide recommendations and advice to the board of directors relating to general policy issues, including development of new policies and a review of existing policies. And this committee accomplished a significant amount of work, and it was felt that this work could be strengthened to include an additional focus on governance and accountability. So We may have mentioned this before, but a review was undertaken of all TNRD committees. And the result of that review was to expand the scope of the policy review committee to restructure it as a policy and governance committee. So the expanded mandate is to provide advice and make recommendations to the board regarding general policy issues, development of new policies and review of existing policies, as well as governance matters. So in terms of policies, really important, they provide direction to the board and staff on a variety of issues and matters, procedures, services, financial responsibilities, and so forth. Board policies act as guidelines and rules, and they're a really important tool in the work that local governments do. And as public documents, board policies in particular also provide transparency and accountability to the public that board and staff decisions are consistent and fair. So what does governance mean? We've been hearing this word a lot. So generally speaking, in the local government context, it's how an organization operates to provide services and be accountable to the communities that they serve. It's political and organizational processes through which decisions are made and implemented. And good governance is being accountable, transparent, participatory, responsible, inclusive, responsive, and efficient. What types of matters will come to the Policy and Governance Committee? Policy updates will still come to this committee and changes, including recommendations for any new policies. General governance issues such as communication, so improving communication with our residents, increasing public engagement with our residents, accessibility, and accountability processes. Intergovernmental relations and advocacy, so advocacy matters related to other levels of government will also come to this committee. And we expect First Nations relationship building and engagement initiatives may come to this committee as well if the board identifies this as a priority in the upcoming strategic planning session. And just a note on that, if those initiatives do come to this committee, a future report will come to the committee and the board, and we will look at ways that we can have First Nations representation on this committee. And any other policy issues or governance matters referred to this committee by the board. The role of the committee, again, like all committees, is an advisory body and to consider policy and governance matters and make recommendations on those matters to the board. In terms of staff support, the General Manager of Corporate and Legislative Services, that's me, or my designate in my absence, is the main liaison to this committee, but you will see other staff bringing forward policies and initiatives to this committee as well. And the role of staff in this context is to provide advice, information, and support the development of agenda items and promote the effectiveness of committee operations. Questions? Director Stamer.
Thanks for that. Just to back the bus up a little bit, why would we be asking a First Nations member to this committee?
Because if we're looking at initiatives to increase First Nation, if this committee looks at initiatives or strategies to increase First Nations engagement or partnerships with First Nations, then of course we would want them at the table as part of those discussions.
Supplement to that, they don't have to be a member of the committee to do that.
Well, they would. What do you mean? Don't have to be a member?
What I'm saying is you end up going across a line that hasn't been opened before in those opportunities to have the members of either the board or the committee. So what I'm asking is it necessary for them to be a member of the committee to form input into policy that you're proposing? Because you may not realize it is, but it is.
I mean, from a staff perspective, I think it would be the appropriate venue to have them and to have that representation. But this is obviously something that we would be taking to the board and taking direction from the board on.
Any other questions? Having been on that committee last term, they do a yeoman's amount of work on it. We've got an awful lot done, and much of that is due to Deanna and her staff. So moving on, classes. I'm assuming you're doing policy review progress. Yeah, thank you.
So as Chair Bass mentioned, and I alluded to in the my earlier presentation, that there was a lot of progress and achievements that came out of the former committee. So I just wanted to highlight some of that work. So there was a significant policy review that was undertaken by staff in the former policy review committee. Between 2021 and 2022, over 16 new or updated board policies were approved by the board and ultimately reviewed and recommended for approval first by this committee. And those policy updates and changes addressed a number of gaps. And the TNRD also has a policy framework, which was developed and reviewed and approved by this committee as well. And just for this committee's awareness, this policy framework is something that many local governments and public bodies are moving towards. So it's coming up with a consistent sort of formula and method for reviewing policies and who is responsible for those policies, who's responsible for approving them, and just ensuring that policies are created and updated in a consistent manner. So as it noted here, it ensures that policies are relevant and consistent with applicable board directives, operational requirements, bylaws, legislation, and regulations. The framework describes how to review and approve policies, the difference between board and administrative policies, which I'll go through in a moment. And it clarifies the roles and responsibilities of the board and staff in the policy development process. It also identifies the overarching policy goals of the TNRD and the policy process, including approval of policies. And I realized that this framework wasn't linked on your agenda. That was my error. So I'll make sure that that's sent out to this committee so you have some familiarity with it. And it also, as I said, it identifies the roles and responsibilities in the policy process and requires that policies are reviewed at minimum every 3 years. So there's a difference between board policies and administrative policies. So board policies are at a governance level. They provide direction on board activities and matters that may directly affect board business, members of the public, and the TNRD's programs and services. They're guidelines and rules for the direction of the TNRD's strategic objectives, initiatives, and services, and they are formally adopted by the board. So they're big picture directives, and as I noted, typically at a governance level. So then there's administrative policies, which staff are responsible for, and they provide direction internally to TNRD staff in carrying out their duties. And their steps or procedures for certain TNRD activities, directives for specific staff members and departments or roles, and they're typically very operational in nature. And individual departments are responsible for these policies and they're approved by the CAO. So administrative policy work. So we like to update this committee on administrative policies that get updated because they're not approved by the board and they're approved by the CAO. We still want to ensure that this committee and the board and the public are aware of any updates to our administrative policies in the interest of transparency and accountability. So staff worked in step with the former committee and continue to work in step with this committee on updating and developing new administrative policies. So I noted the number of board policies that had been updated or come forward in terms of administrative policies between 2021 and 2022. Over 14 new or amended policies came forward to the CEO for approval in the areas of technology, finance and expenses, HR, new code of conduct policy, and new conflict of interest policy. Switching gears back to board policies, there's still quite a bit of policy work for this committee to do. At the upcoming April meeting of this committee, you'll see a new freedom of information policy coming forward, as well as a new privacy policy. We're looking at updating our flag protocol policy. There will be an updated disclosure, also known as a whistleblower policy. And anytime there's changes in direction from the board, legislation, bylaws, that could result in the need for further amended or new policies. So I just wanted to touch on accountability. Oh, did you have a question?
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question on the code of conduct policy. Are we right up to date on that now with the new legislation? I haven't seen a copy of that. I've read quite a bit about what's in other districts' policies, And I went to have a look, and if you can maybe send me a copy of that so we can look at it, because I'm a little concerned that we don't have the same abilities as some of the other districts have in code of conduct.
So-
and handling people that basically don't respect the board or staff.
Mhm.
So if I could get a copy, that would be great.
Yep, no problem, Director Laird. And just for clarity, though, that code of conduct policy that I was referring to is a staff code of conduct policy, so the administrative policy. I think you're referring to the board code of
Yes.
conduct policy,
Yeah.
which we have a legislative requirement to actually bring that back to the board for a review. So I will send you the one that we have now, but just so you know, we will be bringing forward a report in March to have that policy reviewed and seek direction from the board if you would like it updated.
That's great. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem. So just touching on accountability. So a number of the policy gaps that existed previously were identified through the forensic audit. So in 2021, as this committee likely knows, BDO Canada carried out a forensic audit of past TNRD expenses, TNRD policies, and contract and procurement processes. And findings, including the recommendations of the forensic audit, were made public as part of the TNRD's commitment to accountability and transparency. So there were 18 control weaknesses that were identified, resulting in a total of 65 individual recommendations. And as I noted, many of the recommendations were related to policy gaps, and we are extremely proud to say that a number of those gaps, almost all of those gaps, have now been addressed. We've completed over 95% of addressing those recommendations within a year's time. And we've committed to a compliance audit to ensure that the TNRD continues to be accountable to its commitments in those recommendations. And it's a continued opportunity for the TNRD to be leaders in local government best practices. I'm also really proud to say that a number of regional districts now reach out to us, asking for examples of many of our policies to use as a basis for developing some of their policies. Any questions?
Janet, could you explain, for my benefit at least, what a compliance audit is?
So my understanding is it's a sort of an internal audit looking at whether or not we've just ensuring that we've put controls in place to address any of our like policy gaps, any of our process gaps. So it's like an internal controls review, basically.
Thank you. Questions from anyone? Okay, thank you. 5.3 Building Regulations Bylaw 2066 Enforcement Policy Update. Who's handling that? Oh, hi, I didn't see you there.
Surprise! So I don't have a PowerPoint. Just have my voice. This is a little overdue. It's been on my to-do list. We had a board policy. It was quite informal. It was passed by resolution. It's still a board policy. It was passed in summer of 1999, and we've been using it ever since, and it's time to update it. I'm happy, and part of it is, again, we've been using it, and we've used it to defend a claim last year. Was it last year or was it the year before? Yeah. And basically what it was is we will take reasonable action to put notices on title and enforce the building bylaw. So we have section, we call it section 57, that's under the community charter. We have two policies that pertain to that, board policies. One is the process and how and why we use them, where we use them. And the second is how you, if you have a notice on title, how to get rid of it, how to deal with it after the fact. So the amendment I'm requesting is really first to formalize what we're already doing in a board policy, existing policy 9.1.1, the building violation enforcement procedure, and also to revise that date, move it up from 1999. And the logic, the reason I've recommended January 1st of 2013 is spelled out on about 5 bullets on page 3 of your report. I don't know what, page 8 of the agenda, I think. So really, going backwards, first off, a building permit from 2000 is far less of a liability. The ownership has changed, everything's been covered up. Maybe there's been further renovations. Second, it was in this end of December of 2012 that a new building code came into effect, and that's always a struggle. When we open up delinquent files from 10, 20 years ago, the building code gets republished. So a whole new code usually comes out every about 6 years. They'll make tweaks as they go along. That's constant. So this year we will have a new building code. It will substantially replace the code that was issued in, I believe there was one in 2018. That's when the energy requirements started. The code that will be coming in this year will require step 3 of the energy, steps 1 to 5 of the step code. Up to now, only step 1 has been required. Now, this year, step 3 will be required. So again, when we open up those old permits, we try to exercise, and we do have delegated authority, the building inspectors do, to be reasonable, but not on life safety, but on other kinds of things. So the further back we go in a permit, the owners and we just don't want to touch it. We do over 600, so that's 2 every day, including weekends, building information requests. Those are industry standard now. What those are is a realtor, a lawyer, a buyer or a seller basically get us to pull up all the building permit history of the property. And if there's all kinds of buildings on a parcel and there's no record of any permits or occupancy, this needs to be relayed publicly. Whether there's a section 57 on the property or not also gets relayed and disclosed. You can see it from a title search. So really, this would put into the formal policy a trigger date of January 1st, 2013, beyond which we get to basically close all the older building permit files from before that date and put them in the basement and free up space. Any questions, Chair, before any other points of clarification on my report?
Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Regina, what happens if we've got a property that was flagged, has a notice on title, whether the buyer cares or not cares, and it's gone through the process, but someone now comes along and they want to turn around and purchase the property and they want to be able to get a mortgage? How does that, can they still get an inspector to inspect the property? How do we get, like, how are they able to be covered on that?
Okay, so, depends who you ask, yeah.
If I can, what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
somebody could have been on notice in 1999. Somebody comes along and buys it, they really don't care. They don't care.
Absolutely.
And they just keep going, and we've got the file building, and all of a sudden someone comes along and says, yeah, I actually want to be able to, add to this existing building. What do we do?
Okay, so we do have an internal operating procedure. There's a whole bunch of questions in there. Let me just.
No, but I mean,
Yeah.
way to get around that.
So first, there are cases like the one we went to court on. Basically, the only way to deal with that one would have been a demolition. There are cases like that. It was in the creek. It was in Cherry Creek. So there are cases like that. That said, most cases are not like that. They might require partial demolition. They typically require engineers, code consultants. Sometimes we don't want to go in, because if we go in and inspect it and say it's all good, we now own it. We'd rather have somebody else on that. Our job as administering building permitting is to administer inspections as the construction goes, right? If it's all concealed and covered up, how do we know if it's been done right? Engineers or architects they'll go in and they'll just, sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, well, dig up, I want you to dig here, show me the footing. So it's kind of random, but if they're willing to take that liability and stamp that as substantially to code, that's the kind of, and safe for the purposes intended are the key words we look to. So there are definitely cases. Last year, if you look at the stats, last year, we released 13 section 57s off title. And that's because it was, I mean, we answered to probably 50. Because it was such a hot real estate market. And I know I've been asked by folks at the city, well, the city doesn't have to, when I worked for a municipality, or even the municipalities we serve in building inspection, don't have that many section 57s, because you can't build a whole new house. You need to get water and sewer from the city. So you know you need a building permit. Also, I am sure hoping the amount gradually as we're catching up. So it's not just closing the files pre-2013, but when we implemented this policy in the first version of this policy, only 18% of building permits went to completion. It was kind of the Wild West. That's not unique to the TNRD. That was standard even in municipalities. We're now at the point where I think we're 89% finished and complete. So I gotta hope that in future, there's not gonna be 2 or 3 section 57s coming to the board once a month. But yes, they can convey. You can sometimes get a mortgage. Sometimes you can't, it depends who the lender is, but at least the notice is on title. So the lender would review a title before lending money against it, unless it's your Aunt Martha and she doesn't care.
So if I may, so what I'm suggesting, I'm asking then is if everything that's done pre-2013, but we cannot prove that it has a final inspection, can we say that?
Yeah, we absolutely do say
Okay,
that.
okay.
However, we also.
So what you're saying is we can still continue to say that,
Yeah.
we're not going to contain any information on record because we don't may have the records.
So what we do, if you turn to the the policy, it says here, to lessen whatever repercussions this situation may have on property owners, the TNRD Building Department will continue to receive and disseminate any mitigative, thank you, information. So for example, you built a house, whether there's a notice on title or not, say there isn't, but we do and that's the majority of them. The realtor does, it's usually a realtor does a BIR, it's usually should be the listing realtor, and then disclose all that. You built a house, there was no final, but you had we disclose what inspections were done, what was passed, and then, but you don't want that to affect your property value. You yourself can hire an engineer or somebody qualified. And it's typically not just like the folks that call themselves building inspectors for the purposes of comfort. It usually has to be a professional of some kind. To go through and review everything, write a report, stamp it, give it to us. We'll add it to the file and we'll disclose that for any future cases of BIRs or inquiries. That puts you in a better situation for a sale, because sometimes people have gotten a bit sneaky, and what we found, and this was something we just didn't see 20 years ago, people, even if it has had the final, they'll do a freedom of information and want the inspection reports. That doesn't happen in a hot market, but if it's a little slow, and they'll find anything that we might have written in any concern about the perimeter drainage. It failed, you have to fix this. And then they'll try to use that to negotiate the price of the property down. That didn't happen last year, but it's happened before. So people are free to, we will add whatever they've collected and add it to the file. And if it clarifies anything on their building permit file after the fact, at any time.
And that also protects the TNRD because we're not doing the final inspection.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Chair Roden?
Just under financial implications. You say there are no immediate financial implications to the TNRD. Rather, if there is an issue or potential claim on a pre-2013 building permit, this change will strengthen our and the Municipal Insurance Association position in respect to a policy defense. So that means that if we implement a policy stating pre-2013, we're not doing it. If a pre-2013 issue arises, we can point to our policy and say, it's right here in black and white that we have not pursued it as per policy.
That's exactly it. And that's what we did with the 1999 policy. Because in that case, I believe we put the notice on title. It was under the then municipal act and it was a different number. I think it was an 8889. So this really keeps it current.
Director Middleton?
Is there opportunity or does the TNRD charge for this service to do all this, you know, background record hunting and whatnot?
Yeah.
So they could get it one of two ways, a request that they would then pay for the TNRD services to present those records. Or they could just FOI it and they pay their $25 and then you have to do it free.
So that's interesting. So it's routine, building information is routinely releasable. And I've had that challenge where people are concerned maybe something's going up in the neighborhood and they want to see. So we release the elevations, we release the site plan routinely. We don't always release the floor plan because goodness, it could be somebody wanting to know where your panic room is. Or what you've got going on in the basement. We don't, that goes through admin and a freedom of information request, but building information is routinely releasable. It's in the public realm. The city also, and Kamloops, we have a similar process. You folks do it, you have a whole department. We do it through our building department. We charge $75 per release. We've had cases where I guess if people don't want to pay the $75, they could get it in that free time, but then they got to wait a lot longer. So we usually get the BIRs out in a week. Now, it's tricky. If there's a notice on title, in the community charter, it says we must release all our records for that. So like, for example, this afternoon in the board meeting, it's an open meeting. You have 3 section 57s on your agenda. The entire content of that is handed over when we write them in such a way that it's really clear and there's no charge for those. That's just in the public realm. That's not a FOIPOP and it's not even a BIR. We often get questions like, tell me what I need to do to get the notice on title. Well, if we haven't been in the property, how, you know, sometimes it's really hard to tell. It's much easier to release a notice if there's been some level of inspection. And like I said, last year, when we released 13, there's a fee of $200, which basically that covers our LTO costs for putting them on the title and taking them off. We do not intend to be punitive with that $200. Save your money for because you need to hire the engineers and plumbers or the mechanical engineers, or a surveyor to do a site survey. That's always my biggest concern and I feel our biggest exposure in the TNRD is siting and geohazard, geotech. And we've had some tragedies where people thought they found a pin and thought it was that pin. Well, yeah, it's a pin, but it wasn't the pin they thought it was. So that's kind of where I lose my sleep at night.
Any other questions? Director Stamer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regina, where are we at with the provincial government and the changes to the code when it comes to building your own home? I know last year there was a real jam. Like if I want to build my own home, I can still do it, but it's a real hassle. Has the BC government sped that process up or is it worse?
It's worsened. So basically, there's like and we will be bringing to the board as well as all the municipalities where we do a building service. Again, there's new code coming up, the step code and the whole process where you hire an energy advisor to basically replicate what you're going to build in a 3D model on a computer to do an analysis of where your windows are, what's your overhang, what is your wall made out of, what kind of window it is. All of that will be coming to our board. I'm thinking in end of March, probably April, actually, or maybe May at the latest. So I find, and I've built and worked in construction in 3 provinces. Now, in BC, there's a kind of respect for people being able to, do it yourself. But so they don't foreclose the opportunity of building your own home, but instead they put a whole bunch of barriers in the way. And the new code will be more complicated, more expensive to build even a basic home. There is no, so even if you're going to build the simplest little home, you still need the HPO, you need to pass the exam, and you need to carry the insurance as the registered builder. Just like if you hired a contractor, they'd be carrying that insurance for 10 years. So everything that HPO has put into place, and there's always people gaming the system. So that's why they created the exam. Prior to 2006, you could just build your own home without the exam. And the exam, we just had somebody in our office pass the exam, but there was some real silly trick questions in there that a homeowner shouldn't have to answer.
The reason I'm asking the question is because, again, it ticks me off that if you've got enough experience, you should be able to follow the rules and not have to worry about it. And if we're trying to get away from people that are making shoddy buildings and whatever, that's one thing. But the reason I'm asking the question is because there's a lot of people out there that are getting contractors that are not certified. And part of the reason why is because it's very expensive for these guys and gals to be certified because of the insurance end of things. So a lot of people are getting somebody else to do the work and then getting somebody else to basically sign off on it. And what I can see going forward is that it's going to be even that much onerous on us, particularly outside the municipal boundaries, where people are going to be doing this. They're going to say, this is a bunch of BS. It's adding a whole bunch of costs. I can get ABC to build it for me and I'll get DEF to try to stamp it for me. So do you foresee any challenges with the TNRD going forward with this kind of stuff? Because it's just going to make it that much harder because there's just not enough capacity with the certified contractors to do the work.
No.
Right. So what do you foresee going forward?
So we have a new premier who's focused on housing affordability and housing demand. And yet there's still, right now, there is one, remember when we were in the Sandman Center, we were worried about that we had a presentation from the fellow who's now gone, Andrew Appleton. He was responsible for administering the riparian area regulation. And I think it was Arjun who asked him, well, how many people do you have reviewing this? So right now there's one, and it's pretty well a year wait. So, I mean, you can just avoid building, keep your house back 30 meters and avoid building. But some cases like the one on Monty Lake that's on your agenda this afternoon, the property isn't even 30 meters deep, so you can't. So the province is here, they're making statements that they want to have more housing, but at the same time, they're not staffing the regulations they're putting in. I'm getting political, aren't I? They're not. We're just like little local government out here in the back of Beyond. And we when we're asked for input on, like for the new building code, we were asked for input from the building standards branch on the step code. So we put a lot of effort and we tried to be really constructive because there's no point in saying it's all wrong. it's better to just try to go, okay, if you're gonna do this, here's also another way you might want to entertain. And to be fair, on the step code, they allowed a prescriptive option. So you don't have to spend money on a consultant. You can just, okay, limit the number of glazing, increase your insulation, put it into the house and meet the prescription. So there's an example of, I don't want to beat up the province too bad, where they did find another way, but there are, you're right, there's people gaming HPO and the insurance model. But the homeowner protection office has a very active enforcement wing that does follow up. And we've reported where people fake the registration number, for example. There's nothing we can do. They gave us the HPO registration, we issued the permit, but then we send it back to HPO, go, this doesn't look right. And sure enough, somebody falsified the documents. So in that way, we kind of work with them. But there's a lot of cases where somebody else is doing the construction and they've paid somebody just that has a insurance, I guess, a registration. But we sometimes will go to the level of dealing with the actual insurance companies when we find something really wrong and dangerous. And we have time. There's an example out your way where somebody built a suspended slab garage. They built the whole house without a permit and didn't have a structural engineer. HPO signed it off. I don't know who actually built it, but it turns out that garage floor with bedrooms underneath, I would add, it wasn't structurally capable of supporting, like it might have supported a Golf, but not a F-150, and the garage was large. So that's in a case like that, we deal with the insurers, because then on that property, we put a notice on title to protect ourselves.
Any other questions? Oh, there's nobody behind me. Okay, thank you very much. Is there a recommendation? Moved by someone? Moved by Chair Roden and seconded by Director Middleton. Any questions on it? Any opposed? Carried, thank you. And we're on to new business. New business from anyone? Director Stainer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so further, Regina, like, do you foresee in the next couple of years that we're gonna have to put that much more emphasis in, not necessarily our inspections, but like even in just what our building inspectors are doing when we start seeing some of the hangups with some of the new regulations? Do you see anything that's going to affect, your office, not from a legal perspective, but just a workload perspective?
I think workload, we're doing really well right now. I think we need. That's a difficult question, Director Stamer, because let us think and we'll get back to you. And I promise we'll try to answer that question in April when we bring the bylaw amendment to the board on our building bylaw. I'm happy to say the service is fairly stable financially because we've done well in the last few years. We have good reserves. We're ready for a slowdown. And so, the years when we were really busy, we weren't keeping up with our notices on title. We're now going to focus on that because when it's slower, we can do more review of old files. And our priority in our building department is always people who if they need an inspection that day, we do it. We try to capacity build to train people, like if contractors want equivalencies or have questions. And we did, if you remember, 8 years ago, we did customer satisfaction surveys for the building. And I was sort of shaking in my boots, but the feedback was really good.
Anyone else? No? Okay. 45 minutes, not bad. Thank you very much. Motion to adjourn. Thank you, Director Middleton. See you this afternoon.